Hello coders, I'm Ethan W. from Project Game Changer, and today we are going to learn how to code a two-player spaceship game. In this game, you are trying to score as many points against your opponent by hitting them in a certain amount of time. Before we get started, make sure you are comfortable with the following: basic code flow in Tynker, control blocks and their functions, events and how they work, and lastly, the blue sensing blocks such as key pressed or touching. If you haven't learned these yet, go ahead and check out our previous tutorials on games like Tag. Without further ado, let's get started. This is a brand new block coding project in Tynker. So what we're going to do first, as with any other Tynker project, is set up the stage and actors. So let's go ahead and click on Stage and find the background that we'd like to use for our spaceship game. For me, this would be in sci-fi, and I'm going to use this background, but you can choose anything that you'd like. And since we're not going to be using this cute little monster for our spaceship game, we can go ahead and click on him, then click the trash can to delete him. Now let's find our spaceships. The ones that I'm using will be on the left side under this leaf, and it will also be under sci-fi. I'll just go ahead and drag out this guy and this guy. For us, they're a little bit big, so let's resize them a little bit by dragging the corners. And while we're at it, we might as well put it in a new spot. Now that we've positioned our spaceships, let's make them move. Go ahead and click on Code on the top and click on Player 1 so that it's selected with the blue bar next to it. There is a when up arrow is pressed, but that's kind of slow and it has a lot of issues. So let's drag in 2 on starts. Next, let's go to Control on the left side and find Forever If. If you don't know what that does, it's basically like a forever block with an if statement inside of it. This and this do the exact same thing. Once we have 2 forever if blocks inside the editor, find Sensing on the left and drag key up arrow pressed into the slots in forever if. Now, since we're editing player 1 right now, which is on the left side of the screen, we're going to use the W key to move up and the S key to move down. So let's replace the first up arrow pressed with W pressed and the second with S pressed. Once you have that, go to Motion and find Change Y by 10 pixels. Now let's drag that into both the forever if key W is pressed and if key S is pressed. And since we want to go up when W is pressed, let's change Y by 1 pixel forever when W is pressed and -1 when S is pressed. +1 will make it go up and -1 will make it go down. Now if we press play and use the W and S keys, you will see the spaceship move up and down. Now let's do the same thing for the second player. Let's drag both onStart rules into player 2 and Tynker will copy the code for us. So if we click on player 2 now, you can see it has both of the rules without us having to do any extra work. And since it's player 2, which is on the right side, we want to use the up arrow to move up and the down arrow to move down. Now when we play it, you can see that both spaceships can move when their arrow keys are pressed. Now that we have movement in our 2 spaceships, let's add the bullets that they are going to shoot. So let's find our way to the Add Actor button and click on Drawing Tool, because all we need for the bullet is one dot. So let's just put one dot and let's call it bullet 1, and let's save that. And we'll do the same thing for player number 2. Now, since we don't really want them on the stage when the game starts, let's just go ahead and drag them off to the side. Perfect. Now for the bullet, we're going to use something called clones. Basically, a clone is another instance of the same object. So if we clone a bullet, the clone is also going to be a bullet. It's just a second one. So when we press the key to fire a bullet for either player 1 or player 2, let's create a clone of the bullet. So let's find when up arrow pressed, and let's drag that on to bullet 1. This time, instead of using the forever if, we are using the when up arrow pressed, because that is the perfect event for pressing the key once. So since we are doing player 1's bullet, we want that to fire when the letter D is pressed. So let's do when D is pressed, create a clone. And to find that, we will go to Control and scroll down until you find Create Clone. Let's drag that in and change any to self because we want to clone the bullet. Great. If we were to do this, it's going to create a clone, but the clone doesn't do anything. So let's drag in a clone startup rule. This tells the clone what to do as soon as it's created. And since this is player 1's bullet, we want it to start exactly where player 1 is and then move to the right. So let's find motion and drag in go to. Now this says go to mouse pointer, but we want it to go to player 1. So let's just change that real quick. Great. Now if we click play, if we press D, you see the bullet appears right here, or the clone of the bullet actually. Now, after it goes to player 1, let's make the bullet go right forever. Because as soon as it's made, we want it to go right until it hits the edge or it hits the player. So let's drag in a forever block. And as you can imagine, that makes all of the code inside it run forever. So now let's find motion and find point in direction. Drag that in under go to and point it to the right, which is 90 degrees. Now let's find move forward 10 pixels. Since 10 is a little bit fast, let's change it to something like 3 for now. We can always change it later, but we'll just go with that. So now, if we play the project and press D, this is what happens. But you see, there's too many clones. They never destroy themselves, and they're making the project lag. Now to fix this, let's first make it so that when it's on the edge, it will destroy itself. So go ahead and find the if block. So go to Control and find if false then. Let's drag that in, and we want it to destroy itself when it's on the right side of the screen. If you don't know the coordinates of the right side of your screen, you can click this little box that looks like a window on the bottom right, and you'll see there's a bunch of numbers on the screen. Each one is a coordinate. It has 2 numbers. The X coordinate, which goes from left to right, and the Y coordinate, which goes from the bottom to the top. Over here on the right side, we can see x682y0. So we want the bullet to destroy itself once its x position is greater than 682. To do this, we can go to operators and find the greater than. So let's drag that into the false spot, and we want when x position, because we're measuring the left-right distance of the bullet, we'll find x position, and once it's greater than 682, then we'll destroy the clone by going to Control and then finding delete this clone. And to find x position, you can go to motion and find x position. Once we have that, let's play the project again. So now, if I press D, the bullet will create a clone of itself and move until it hits the right side of the screen, which means after firing a few bullets, it doesn't really lag up. But there's still one problem. We can fire a lot of bullets at one time, and once you have this many clones, it really starts to lag. So let's make sure that there can only be one bullet on the screen at a time. And to do this, we can use something called a variable. But what exactly is a variable? Great question. You've probably seen variables in some of your favorite games, like Mario's life counter, the timer, or even a high score tracker in Pac-Man. All of these use variables to keep track of a value. If I'm in a game, I'm an explorer, and sadly, I have 0 money, and also no food, which is pretty sad. I can read this piece of paper like a variable, or I can write on it if it changes. I need to get some money, so I'll go on a quest. Great! After I completed that quest, you can see I now have some money. So instead of 0, I can change this variable to 1. So now I have $1. But at the same time, I'm still hungry. So I'm going to give $1 to the shop. So now I have $0 again. But I can take an item from the shop. In this case, I'll take this crunch bar. So now I can change my food counter to 1 because I have this delicious crunch bar. Did you see how I used the piece of paper to track something in my game? That's exactly how a variable works in code. It keeps track of something. So let's create a variable to track the bullet's clone number. Let's tap Create Variable, and let's name it Number of Clones, Bullet 1. Now we're going to choose for all actors, because for this actor only means that each clone has its own version of the piece of paper. And if we do that, it just won't work. So go ahead and choose for all actors and click Create. And now you can see this piece of paper is right here. This is our variable. It's called number of clones. Now, what we're going to do with this is when we create the clone, we're going to change it by 1. So when we press play, it'll default to 0. So it'll start out as 0. But when we press D, the number of clones will increase by 1, so it'll change by 1. Now, we want to make it so that when a clone is deleted, it goes back down 1. So if we drag a change by block into this if block, then we can change it by -1, which means it'll decrease by 1. So it'll go back from 1 total clone to 0. And the reason we do this is so we can check if there's already a clone or not before we fire another bullet. So to do this, we'll drag an if false block into when D is pressed. And then we'll drag the clone by the left side into that. Next, we'll find the less than and we'll drag it into the false spot. Then, to read off of the piece of paper called number of clones, we click on variables on the left and find number of clones, bullet 1. And let's drag that onto the left side of the less than block. Now, we want it to happen if there's 0 clones. So we'll say less than 1. We could change this to something like 2, and then it would happen if there's less than 2 bullets on the screen. But for now, we're only going to let 1 bullet be on the screen at a time. So, if we run it, you can see that when I press D multiple times, only 1 bullet is on the screen at a time. And also, the variable won't reset when you stop the game. So let's drag out an on start, and when the game starts, make sure to set number of clones to 0. Now, let's do the same thing for the second player's bullet. Let's once again copy and paste all of the code into bullet 2 by dragging each set of blocks to bullet 2. But you only want it to fire when you press the left arrow instead of the letter D. But there are a few issues here. For example, this counts the number of clones for bullet 1, but you want it to count the number of clones for bullet 2. So let's create another variable. This time, let's call it number of clones for bullet 2. And once again, let's choose for all actors. If you don't want to do the on start, you can also choose reset variable on stop. And what we want it to do is set to 0 every time. So now that we have number of clones for bullet 2, go ahead and put that in for everywhere you used to see bullet 1. And since we don't need to reset it every time, we can just drag this to the trash can. Another issue we need to fix is for player 2's bullet, you want it to start at player 2 and move left. Let's change it to go to player 2 and point towards the left, which is -90 degrees. And one thing I forgot is we want to destroy the clone if the X position is less than -682, which is the left side of the screen. So once the bullet is to the left of it, we'll destroy the clone. And for this one, we'll find less than, and then we put X position on the left and say -682. And that should fix our problem. The last thing that we are going to do for this video is create the collision and destroy the bullet when it collides with the other player. So for the first player's bullet, it is going to be destroyed if we bump into player 2, and player 2's bullet will be destroyed if it bumps into player 1. To get that going, let's drag in a when occurs block. Then let's find the sensing block called touching mouse pointer. Drag it in, then change it to touching player 2. This rule will run when bullet 1 touches player 2. And for this, we are going to delete the clone the same way we delete it if it hits the edge of the screen. And that would be to decrease the number of clones for bullet 1 and then delete the clone. So let's just select these two blocks and then copy and paste them. Then you can just drag them to the when occurs rule. And after that, we can drag this rule to bullet 2 so that bullet 2 can have the same rule. In bullet 2, let's just change it so that the clone will be deleted when it hits player 1 instead of player 2. And once again, we are changing the number of clones for bullet 2 by -1 instead of player 1's bullets. And just like that, the bullets should now disappear as soon as they hit the other player. You can now fire shots that will either hit the other player or the edge of the screen. With that, you have your basic movement and shooting. We will get to adding scores, animation, sounds, and more in the next few videos, so stay tuned and see you soon.